Don't let diaper rash come between you and your baby. Diaper rash can be one of the worst experiences your little one has to go through, and keeping their delicate skin happy and healthy shouldn't require a spatula to apply thick, goopy treatments that can be just as irritating and uncomfortable as the diaper rash. Instead, try Dr. Mom Butt Balm. Dr. Mom Butt Balm is a pediatrician-approved skin protectant, free of dyes, preservatives, and zinc oxide. It was developed by a mom who is also a doctor when she couldn't find any traditional products that worked for her baby's persistent diaper rash. Use just a small amount of Dr. Mom Butt Balm to help soothe your baby's skin and feel good about making the right choice. Nothing comes between you and your baby, not even diaper rash. Check out Dr. Mom Butt Balm, available on Amazon or Walmart.com. Back in the day when my girls were born, it was not easy to share photos and videos with loved ones, but you have a fantastic option available, the Family Album app. The Family Album app was created in 2015 and has operated in the long term to give parents a secure and easy way to share photos and videos with loved ones. It's a totally secure personal haven for your family's memories. I love that there's no third-party ads, no unwanted eyes. Now, let me share some of the great features that make the Family Album app a go-to app. First off, the app automatically sorts photos and videos by month, allowing you to swipe back in time and see how your child has grown. No more scrolling through endless feeds or searching through folders. Another cool feature about the Family Album app is you can order 8 free photo prints every month to be delivered to your home. It's really nice to have some tangible pictures to hold on to or share to document each month of your baby's life. Plus, the Family Album app has unlimited storage and it is totally free. Yes, you heard that right. No more worrying about running out of space or being bombarded by ads when you're just trying to relive those heartwarming moments. So if you are still trying to use other messaging apps for your kids' photos, it is time to level up your family photo game with a free photo sharing app. Head over to the App Store today, search Family Album, it's all one word, download the app, and start creating a legacy of love one photo at a time. What exactly is amniotic fluid? What does it mean for your baby if your amniotic fluid is too low? What does it mean for your baby if your amniotic fluid is too high? You are going to learn all about it in this episode. Welcome to the All About Pregnancy and Birth podcast. If you're having a baby in the hospital, you are giving birth in a system that too often takes away power from women over what happens in their own bodies. I'm Dr. Nicole Calloway Rankins, a practicing board-certified OBGYN who's had the privilege of helping well over 1,000 babies into this world. I've been a doctor for over 20 years, and I'm here to help you take back your power, advocate for yourself, and have the beautiful pregnancy and birth that you deserve. This podcast is for educational purposes only, and it's not a substitute for medical advice. Check out the full disclaimer at drnicolerankins.com/disclaimer. Now let's get to it. Hello there. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. This is episode number 251, whether it's your first time listening or you have listened before. I'm so glad you're spending some time with me today. In this episode, you're going to learn all about amniotic fluid. What is amniotic fluid? What's in amniotic fluid? Where does amniotic fluid come from? How do we measure amniotic fluid? What does it mean when your amniotic fluid is too low? And what does it mean if it's too high? We're covering all of it today. Now, before we get into the episode, I want to do a quick listener shout out. This is from CLOUI87. They left me this review in Apple Podcast, and it says, "Thank you for episode 104. Recently, I realized that I needed to own my pregnancy trauma stories. High-risk pregnancy, relationship hurt, preterm delivery, 2-month NICU stay, missed miscarriage, as what they were, traumatic. I went searching for podcasts to start getting encouragement in my ears. This episode was validating, encouraging, and challenging. Exactly what I needed to start using resources and get more support. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for leaving that review about how impactful that episode was for you. Now, if you also find this podcast impactful in your pregnancy and your birth, I would so appreciate it if you head on over to Apple Podcast and leave me a review. If you really love the podcast, I'd appreciate a 5-star review, but I really just want you to be honest and tell me what you think about the show. I love to hear what you think, and I also do listener shout outs from those reviews. So head on over to Apple Podcasts, let me know what you think all about pregnancy and birth. Okay, let's get into this conversation about amniotic fluid. So first off, what is amniotic fluid? Well, amniotic fluid is the liquid that surrounds your baby after the first few weeks of pregnancy. And it has a number of critical functions that are absolutely essential for normal growth and development of your baby. Amniotic fluid cushions the umbilical cord from getting compressed or squeezed. Amniotic fluid has antibacterial properties that provide some protection from infection. It actually serves as a reservoir of fluid and nutrients for your baby. It also provides the necessary fluid, space, and growth factors to permit normal development of your baby's lungs, musculoskeletal system, and gastrointestinal system. And finally, amniotic fluid helps protect your baby. It just cushions your baby from any trauma if your belly is accidentally hit. Now, what is in amniotic fluid? Well, amniotic fluid is about 98 to 99% water, and then 1 to 2% solids, which includes proteins, carbohydrates, electrolytes, fats, enzymes, hormones. And amniotic fluid also contains a variety of types of fetal cells. So there are skin fetal cells, respiratory fetal cells, intestinal fetal cells, urinary tract fetal cells, stem cells. There's also hair, blood cells, cells that are shed from the amnion. And then sometimes amniotic fluid can get stained with meconium, which is essentially baby poop. So where does amniotic fluid come from? Well, early in the pregnancy, amniotic fluid is likely derived from the surface of the placenta, partially from secretions from the surface of the body of the embryo, and then what's called a transmembranous pathway, which is like transport from the maternal compartment across the amnion. That's a fancy way of saying that fluid kind of comes through the placenta, essentially. And then as the pregnancy progresses, the vast majority of amniotic fluid comes from where? Your baby making urine. Yes, y'all, we all grew up in a pool of urine, our own urine, inside of our mother's bellies. So it's estimated that, especially towards the end of pregnancy, your baby will make anywhere from 800 to 1,200 milliliters a day of urine, okay? 800 to 1,200 milliliters a day of urine. That's about half of a 2-liter bottle every single day that your baby makes. Now, if your baby is making that much urine every day, then how does the fluid level stay constant? Because the amniotic fluid volume actually does not change significantly from day to day. The overall volume stays about the same. And the reason that happens is not only is your baby making 800 to 1,200 milliliters a day, your baby is also swallowing about that same amount a day, a little less, anywhere from 500 to 1,000 milliliters per day. So the amniotic fluid volume, again, doesn't change significantly from day to day, but the amniotic fluid itself is generally completely replaced over 24 hours. So every day your baby makes some, swallow some, makes some, swallow some every single day. Now, how do we measure amniotic fluid? Ultrasound examination is the only way that we can assess amniotic fluid volume. And there are two ways that we do that. One is qualitative, and that's when we just kind of look at the fluid on ultrasound and subjectively say, oh, the fluid looks low, the fluid looks normal, or the fluid looks high. This is actually surprisingly very accurate if it's an experienced person who's looking at the amniotic fluid. And I can say in my experience, you can look and you say, oh, that looks about normal. That looks about low. Oh, that maybe looks a little bit high. So that's actually pretty accurate. And then the other two methods are quantitative, and where we actually measure something. And what we're doing is we're trying to take a 3D picture or a 3D object, the amniotic fluid, and we turn it into a 2D or a two-dimensional measurement. So there are a couple of ways that we can do this. One is called the single deepest pocket. It's also called the maximum vertical pocket or the largest vertical pocket. And it's the vertical dimension in centimeters of the largest pocket of amniotic fluid that does not have any umbilical cord going through it. So it's really on the screen just going to look like a whole lot of black. Amniotic fluid looks just dark on the screen. And the largest pocket can't have any cord in it. It can't have any arms or legs, any fetal extremities in it. And it's supposed to be measured at a right angle to the uterus. Not that that's something that you would know. And the way that we quantify whether the fluid is low, normal, or high is how deep that pocket is. So if the depth is less than 2 centimeters, then fluid is low. And low fluid is called oligohydramnios. Oligo means low and hydramnios is fluid. A normal single deepest pocket or maximum vertical pocket is going to be greater than or equal to 2 centimeters and less than 8 centimeters. That's normal. And polyhydramnios, poly meaning many, hydramnios is fluid. A depth greater than or equal to 8 centimeters is polyhydramnios. Now, the other way that we measure amniotic fluid is something called the amniotic fluid index. And that's calculated by dividing the uterus into 4 quadrants using the linea nigra. That's the line that runs down the middle of your belly button. So we use that line, and on everybody it looks different. Some people it's really prominent. It tends to be more prominent during pregnancy because of the hormonal changes. So we use that line to divide the right and left sides of the uterus, and then across the umbilicus or the belly button, and then that does the upper and lower quadrants. So we do the linea nigra up and down, and then a line across the belly button to make 4 quadrants. And then we measure the maximum fluid pocket in each quadrant that doesn't contain cord, doesn't contain any extremities. It's going to look dark or black. Ultrasound is echogenic. It looks black on ultrasound. And we measure that in centimeters. And the sum of the measurements in each of those 4 quadrants is the amniotic fluid index. So if the amniotic fluid index is less than or equal to 5 centimeters, that's oligohydramnios. If it's greater than 5 and less than 24 centimeters, then that is normal. And if the AFI is greater than or equal to 24, that's polyhydramnios. So let's talk about what it means when you have oligohydramnios and when you have polyhydramnios. So oligohydramnios, again, is when the fluid is low. It's lower than expected for the gestational age of pregnancy. So it's that depth of less than 2 centimeters for the single deepest pocket, or it's an amniotic fluid index. The overall index is less than 5. An adequate amount of amniotic fluid is absolutely, positively critical to normal fetal movement. It's critical to normal growth for your baby. It's critical to cushion the baby and the umbilical cord. So when the fluid is low, these processes may not happen. And that can lead to potentially really severe fetal deformations where the limbs don't form like they should. It can lead to umbilical cord compression. And in extreme cases, it can lead to fetal death. Did you know that 95% of pregnant women are not getting their recommended daily intake of key omega-3s? Enter Ritual. Their prenatal contains 350 milligrams of eco-friendly vegan omega-3 DHA in every serving. One of the reasons I like Ritual is that it's a female-founded B Corp, meaning they are holding themselves accountable to not just their company's financial health, but also the health of people and our planet. In addition to those omega-3 DHAs to support baby's brain development, Ritual also has choline and methylated folate to support baby's neural tube development. And the capsules feature a delayed release design to help make it gentle on an empty stomach. Why settle for a multivitamin you're not 100% sure about? Ritual was literally built on trust, so you know it's the real deal. Get 25% off your first month for a limited time at ritual.com/Dr. Nicole. Start Ritual or add Essential for Women Prenatal to your subscription today. That's ritual.com/Dr. Nicole for 25% off. Now, what causes low amniotic fluid really depends on the trimester. So in the first trimester, the baby's tiny. There's not really a lot of amniotic fluid, period. It's really not common to say there's low fluid in the first trimester. It's just not something that's very often seen. Now, if in the second trimester we see low amniotic fluid, that is very concerning because that's when the baby really begins to make urine. So if the fluid is low in the second trimester, then we're very concerned that there's a problem with the baby's kidneys, with the baby's ureters, which are the tubes that run between the kidneys and the bladder. Is there a problem with the bladder? Is there a problem with the urethra, which gets urine from the bladder to the outside of the body? So we need to know if there's a possibility or there's a concern that something is wrong in that system where urine is not being made at all because maybe there's no kidney or there's something wrong with the kidneys or the urine can't get out. Those issues will account for about 50% of low fluid in the second trimester. Another 35% of low fluid in the second trimester, and that's 14 to 28 weeks. That will be caused by PPROM, something which is PPROM, preterm premature rupture of membranes, which is your water breaks before term, so before 37 weeks, and it's premature, meaning it's before labor starts. So PPROM accounts for about 35% of low fluid in the second trimester. Now, in the third trimester, PPROM accounts for most of low fluid or some sort of uteroplacental insufficiency, meaning the placenta is not working great, the baby is not getting the nutrients that it needs, and it demonstrates that, or it conserves energy by holding on to fluid, holding on to urine, and not actually making urine or making amniotic fluid. In conditions where we can see this show up are preeclampsia, are high blood pressure or diabetes potentially. And often if it's low fluid in the third trimester, it's frequently accompanied by the baby not growing as well. So the baby doesn't have all of the nutrients and things that it needs in order to thrive. And then actually another common cause of low fluid, especially in the summer months, is dehydration. If you are dehydrated and then your baby's not getting enough fluid, then it can actually cause the fluid to be low. And I'll talk about some of the treatments in just a minute. Actually, there's really not much treatments. There are no treatments that have been proven to be particularly effective for low fluid. If we suspect that you're dehydrated, then we do maternal hydration through IV fluids or just have you drink lots, and then we'll recheck the fluid in a day or so to kind of see where things are. But really, there's no treatments that have been proven to be effective in the long term. And the reason that we suspect when the fluid is low, it may be that the baby is measuring smaller than expected, or your uterus is measuring smaller than expected. Or obviously, if you say that you're leaking fluid, then we're going to be concerned and make sure that the fluid level is okay. It's not infrequently found on an ultrasound that's done for something else, for someone who's at risk, for someone who's getting regular ultrasounds. So for example, for someone who has diabetes or someone who has hypertension in pregnancy and they're getting regular ultrasounds, That is when we may pick up low fluid. Most of the time it's found in the third trimester, so that's after 28 weeks. And we can't always necessarily identify what the exact cause is. We know that it's associated with other things, like I said, like diabetes or hypertension, things like that. But it's not always easy to pinpoint the exact cause. Now, the prognosis for low amniotic fluid really depends on when it was diagnosed. So low fluid in the first trimester, unfortunately, that is a very bad sign. If the fluid looks low in the first trimester, 95% of those pregnancies will end in miscarriage. So that's a really bad sign. In the second trimester, if the fluid is borderline low, then pregnancies tend to go on to be normal. So it looks like it's just right on the border of being low. That tends to be okay. However, if the fluid is actually truly low between 13 and 24 weeks, that is also unfortunately a bad sign. Only about 20% of those babies will survive. And of those that do survive, the babies may have anatomical and functional abnormalities like skeletal deformations or contractures, and their lungs are not as developed. That's something called pulmonary hypoplasia. And that's a result of developing in a severely low amniotic fluid environment. That fluid is important to help the limbs move and help the baby to be flexible and move its arms, legs, and things around. When the fluid is low, essentially the baby is squeezed and things just can't develop properly. Now, in the third trimester, the prognosis really depends. The earlier in the third trimester low fluid is diagnosed, then the worse the outcomes. If amniotic fluid or low amniotic fluid is diagnosed towards the end of pregnancy, generally the outcomes are very, 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 very good. So what do we do during pregnancy if low fluid is diagnosed? Well, it really depends on what the underlying condition is. So I don't want to go into that in detail, but in general, it just means we are going to do some closer monitoring, okay? Closer monitoring. Watch the fluid, watch the levels. We'll look at other things like how is the baby growing? We'll look at the blood flow through the placenta. We'll look at the blood flow through the umbilical cord and just keep a close eye on the baby. Very often, if the fluid stays persistently low, then I shouldn't say very often, like always, we're going to recommend induction in early delivery, especially as you get closer to 37 weeks or even sooner sometimes, 36 weeks, because we believe that the baby's going to be better on the outside and the environment that we can provide on the outside and support that we can provide on the outside than what the baby is getting on the inside. Okay. So typically, we watch very closely and we may deliver as early as 37 weeks, maybe even a little bit sooner if the fluid remains persistently low. Hey, so you made it this far in the episode, and I'm thinking it's because you enjoyed this podcast. Well, if that's the case, then I have a favor to ask. Creating and producing the All About Pregnancy and Birth podcast has been one of the greatest joys of my life. I'm so grateful to have each and every one of you on this journey with me. Your support and engagement means the world to me, and it's what helps keep this podcast going. But here's the thing. Producing a podcast involves time, effort, and resources, from recording equipment to an editor, hosting fees, coordinating guests, countless hours spent researching and crafting content. It all adds up. And that's where I could use your support. I've never wanted to turn All About Pregnancy and Birth into a paywall. I want it to remain accessible to everyone. That's why I've set up a way for you to support the show financially, if you're able and willing. If this podcast has helped you during your pregnancy, your birth, or your life, I'm asking you to consider contributing to the show. Your support will help cover production and team costs and ensure that I can continue delivering the episodes you love. So in the month of March, head to drnicolerankins.com/support and contribute whatever you can. Your support, no matter how big or small, makes a significant impact. It helps us continue delivering high quality content and ensures the future of All About Pregnancy and Birth. Again, that's drnicolerankins.com/support. Thank you so much for being part of the All About Pregnancy and Birth community. Now back to the show. So on the flip side is polyhydramnios. Polyhydramnios is when you have excessive amniotic fluid. I actually had that in both of my pregnancies, mildly in the second one, a lot in the first one, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. So this diagnosis is also made by ultrasound examination, and it's a depth at maximum vertical pocket of greater than or equal to 8 centimeters, or the overall fluid volume is greater than or equal to 24 centimeters, the AFI, and it happens in about 1 to 2% of pregnancies. Now, the causes, and you can kind of divide them into 2 big categories. One is increased fetal urine, and the second one is decreased fetal swallowing. Now, the most common causes are fetal structural anomalies, and that is the case what happened with my first daughter. She had something called duodenal atresia, where the first part of her intestines were not connected. It's a condition that happens in about 1 in 7,000 to 1 in 10,000 pregnancies. And when the first part of the intestines aren't connected, when she swallows, the fluid isn't going anywhere. It was the most that it could go is the stomach. So it was basically coming, backing up in a sense, and she couldn't swallow. And so she had a lot of extra fluid, like tons of extra fluid. Like she was in there flipping and dancing and all kinds of things. So that's why she had extra fluid, or I had polyhydramnios with that pregnancy. And then other causes of polyhydramnios are chromosome abnormalities like trisomy 18, which is an extra chromosome number 18. Also, if there are any cardiac problems, and it's something called a high fetal cardiac output state. And basically the baby's heart is pumping out a lot and it causes anemia. That can lead to polyhydramnios. Twin transfusion syndrome can lead to polyhydramnios, where one baby is basically siphoning from the other. There are some rare viruses, infections like parvovirus that can lead to polyhydramnios. Actually, if mom has diabetes, that can be associated with polyhydramnios. We're not exactly sure why. And then sometimes even as many as 30 to 40% of cases of polyhydramnios are what we call idiopathic, meaning we don't know what causes it. So that's what I had with my second daughter. There was no identifiable reason for why I had extra amniotic fluid with her, but she had extra amniotic fluid and there were no other reasons. So when you look at the big picture, about a third are associated with a congenital anomaly, a quarter are associated with diabetes, and the remaining 40% are considered idiopathic. Now, when we look at, or when we suspect polyhydramnios, is when the uterus is bigger than we would expect. For me, I was, especially with my first daughter, when I had lots of extra fluid, I was just huge. People kept ask me, do I have twins? Or, how far along are you? So the uterus is going to be larger than expected for how far along you are in the pregnancy. That's usually the first sign where we check and see, is it the baby that's too big, or is it the fluid that's too much? And it may also be detected when we're looking for other things. So if you have hypertension or diabetes, then we may see it then. Most of the time, the increase in fluid is asymptomatic. Like you don't necessarily notice it if you have increased fluid, but if it's a lot, then you can experience some shortness of breath, especially as you get further along in the pregnancy. And you can also experience contractions. You can have more frequent kind of irritable contractions. They're not labor contractions, but they are contractions. It's like an irritant to the uterus to have all of that fluid there. And it can just feel uncomfortable. You just feel kind of big and sort of miserable. Now, what does it mean for your pregnancy if there is extra amniotic fluid? Well, most cases of idiopathic polyhydramnios, meaning we can't identify a cause, they generally resolve spontaneously, especially if it's mild. But sometimes polyhydramnios can be associated with an increased risk of several outcomes, in addition to some poor outcomes related to some what's called morphologic abnormalities. So it can cause maternal respiratory compromise, meaning mom just has a hard time breathing. It can increase the chances of preterm labor, or preterm rupture of membranes or preterm delivery. I actually went into labor with my first one early at 32 weeks. Did it have to do with the extra amniotic fluid? Maybe. It can definitely lead to fetal malposition, where the baby is not head down, essentially, because the baby has tons of room to flip and change and swim in there. It increases the risk of something called umbilical cord prolapse, where once the water breaks and the umbilical cord comes first through the vagina ahead of the baby, that is a true emergency. We have to rush back immediately for a C-section when that happens. It can lead to an increased risk of placental abruption when the membranes rupture, because when all that water comes out and the uterus kind of shrinks down a little bit or a lot of it potentially, and the placenta can shear away from the wall of the uterus. That rarely happens, but it's a possibility. And then also sometimes the uterus just gets a little bit lazy after birth. If it's been big and full of fluid, it doesn't want to shrink down like we'd like. That can lead to what's called uterine atony, and that can increase the chances of postpartum hemorrhage. Now, as far as management, it really depends on the gestational age as well as the presence of symptoms and the cause. Extra testing is not necessarily needed or standard in extra amniotic fluid like it is in low fluid. So in mild to moderate extra fluid, then typically you may do a non-stress test every 1 to 2 weeks until delivery, and then maybe weekly after that. So it's not necessarily a ton of extra monitoring. And then in very extreme instances, we will reduce the amount of amniotic fluid. That's called amnioreduction. And essentially what it is like, I had this done to try and stop my preterm labor. Is they stick a needle in your belly through your uterus and drain off the amniotic fluid. I know it sounds crazy. It's actually not that painful because the needle's pretty small, but it's just to decompress some of the fluid. And it's really only indicated for severe maternal discomfort or shortness of breath in the setting of really bad polyhydramnios. In my case, they thought maybe it might help slow things down with my labor. It did not. And then in mild to moderate polyhydramnios, and all of the testing looks normal, we typically don't necessarily need to induce labor early, maybe at 39 to 40 weeks, as long as everything looks okay. We don't want to go too far past 40 weeks because the risk of fetal death does seem to increase after that. But unlike oligohydramnios, where we tend to induce a little bit earlier, we can go a bit longer with polyhydramnios. And then the last thing is that during labor, we just have to be really careful about monitoring the baby, because with all of that fluid, babies can move around. They can flip from head down to breech, and have to be careful about breaking your water. Sometimes we wait until we break the water, until we know the head is really nice and well applied to the cervix, so we don't have that umbilical cord prolapse, because that is truly one of the obstetric emergencies where we run to the OR, like rip the cords out of the wall. So we have to be careful about artificially breaking your water and doing that under safe circumstances, or if it ruptures on its own, just making sure that that doesn't happen, or placenta abruption doesn't happen. But most of the time, the extra amniotic fluid doesn't end up being a problem. I very rarely see these things happen with people that have extra amniotic fluid. Okay, so just to recap, amniotic fluid is the fluid that surrounds your baby. It has a number of important functions. It cushions the cord. It's essential for normal growth and development, has some antibacterial properties. It primarily comes from your baby making urine. It gets regenerated every day. Your baby makes the urine, swallows the urine, makes the urine, swallows the urine. We measure it by ultrasound. That's the only way we can measure amniotic fluid. And we do it either by the single deepest pocket or the overall amniotic fluid index. And when it's low, it can have some significant issues for baby. When it's high, it can also have some problems for baby. Neither extreme is very common, but they both require monitoring and special care depending on the cause to make sure that you and your baby are safe. All right, so there you have it. Please subscribe to the podcast in Apple Podcast. And while you are there, leave me that review in Apple Podcast. I would so appreciate it so I can do a shout out for you in an upcoming episode. Also, come follow me on Instagram where I have more great pregnancy and birth information there. I'm on Instagram at Dr. Nicole Rankins. So that's it for this episode. Do come on back next week and remember that you deserve a beautiful pregnancy and birth.